Together with American Songwriter, we had the opportunity to talk to J.P. Harris over Zoom audio. Born in Alabama, J.P. talks about moving from Alabama to San Bernardino County in California and then eventually to Las Vegas. He ended up leaving home by himself at a very early age. He took off at 14, just after 8th grade. And from there, just worked various jobs, all while playing guitar, very interested in the old folk scene. Made a bunch of friends at different fiddle conventions. He ends up moving to Nashville, and from there started really focusing on music full time. He's released 3 full-length records, I'll Keep Calling, Home is Where the Hurt Is, and Sometimes Dogs Bark at Nothing. And he talks about the viral success of his latest song, Take Off Your Tinfoil Hat, after it was shared by Pink, pop star Pink. So make sure to check out that brand new song, Take Off the Tinfoil Hat, J.P. Harris. And check out our past interviews. The videos are up on our Facebook page and YouTube channel at Bringing It Backwards, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Bringing Back Pod.
We'd appreciate your support if you follow and subscribe to our podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts.
We're Bringing It Backwards with J.P. Harris. Awesome. I appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for hollering at me to do it. I'm excited to, have a little chat about the world of music at large. So.
Yes, sir. And our podcast is about your journey, in particular in music. So where you grew up and how you got to where you are now, basically.
Oh, right on. Well, ask away, and I can tell you the long or the annotated versions of all of that, because it's a pretty long story. So,
well, let's get to it then. I did read that you're born in Alabama. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Originally from Montgomery.
Okay, tell me about that.
Internet did not fail you. Yeah. So I was born in Montgomery, just a little while before Valentine's Day in 1983, and that's where. My mom's side of the family has been from a little town and surrounding areas called Dadeville, which is out in Tallapoosa County for, at least a couple hundred years, maybe longer. And my dad's family were all career Air Force. And the last place my granddad was stationed, he was a career heavy aircraft pilot. And the last place he was stationed was at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery. So that's how my dad's family ended up there. But he and his 5 sisters were all born all over the place, Puerto Rico and Texas and California, and they just moved from base to base. They're all Air Force brats, but yeah, that's where I'm from originally. We left there when I was about 6 years old,
okay,
and moved out west looking for work, and kind of ended up in a weird little high desert town, which has grown a lot since I lived there, and for a couple of years in late 80s, early 90s, called Apple Valley, California, that does not have any apples, I can assure you.
I know that. I actually know where that is. We're in San Diego. I was born and raised in California. So yeah, you're out. That's what, like, San Bernardino area.
Yeah, it's Barstow and Victorville is all right there, and kind of the weird halfway point between Vegas and LA. And
my uncle lives out that way still.
Oh, okay.
Like a huge, it was like compound of houses and stuff out there.
It was a good place to do that, I think, for a long time. It was kind of funny because none of us really knew what we were getting into, I think, when we moved out there. My dad moved out before us to start the job, and he was always in heavy construction. He was project manager for a dirt moving company out there, and we'd never seen the West. I mean, I'd never been farther away from Alabama when I was a little kid besides the Georgia coast, and it was a whole kind of new experience and very grapes of wrath in this weird way. We had this crappy Oldsmobile named Oysters, like a 82 old sedan.
And named it Oysters?
That was what my mom named every car. Every car has a name, and I inherited that from her. All of my fleet of obscenely large vehicles all have names too.
That's amazing.
But so we just, and we loaded up. I mean, we had stuff strapped on the roof, and hanging off the trunk, and drove ourselves out there for about 4 or 5 days. And, but it was a big shock because, I was a kid from Alabama, and all my earliest memories are tornado sirens and humidity and, that kind of thing. And so suddenly seeing scorpions and cactuses and, dirt and of course it snows out there because it's high Mojave Desert. So it was a whole nother weird experience, and I guess I'd also basically never heard anybody speak to me without a Southern accent. And, I was immediately sort of like, whoa, this is weird. Kids at school were like, you're from Alabama, you eat dirt, just weird.
Oh.
There's a lot of people thought it was pretty funny to make fun of the hillbilly kids. I guess we had thick accents when we were kids, and we kind of grew out of them from living out west. But lived there for a couple of years, and then my dad's company moved us over to Las Vegas, and then that's where I lived till I was about 14, and then I split town and started out on my wild journey. Yeah, 14 years old. So.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I went and got on a Greyhound bus in the middle of the night, and that was the beginning of a whole nother chapter of adventures. So.
Wow. And how'd you get into music? Were you always a musician or into music prior to?
Yeah. No one in my immediate family really played much. My mom had been she played piano a little when she was a kid, and being sort of from old Southern stock, it was this point of pride that we always had a piano in the house, even though nobody really played it. But she was always singing along with, the radio or records. And she and my dad had a huge, record collection. So I grew up with a wall of vinyl out in the living room. And
that's dope.
Yeah. And it was a cool mix of, really, funny enough, not so much country, like real die-hard country, but lots of 60s and 70s folk and rock and roll records, all your standards, everything from Joni Mitchell to The Dead to Skinner to AC/DC and Foghat, and Nazareth. and my dad was like the rock and roll dude. My mom listened to more of the folk music,
Right
so it was cool, So my mom got me a guitar for Christmas, I guess, maybe when I was 11. It was right before I turned 12 years old. And that was how I started getting into it. I always just had a natural leaning towards wanting to perform. And I was always the kid at family reunions, putting on some stupid little skit, on the picnic table or, hamming it up. So I think I was sort of destined to get up in front of people and make a fool of myself. So.
That's awesome. So, you were obviously playing guitar prior to leaving at 14. Were you playing, were you writing your own songs, and how was that?
A little bit, I got into, I was raised in a really interesting kind of open-minded household. My mom had grown up in sort of a hard-shell Baptist town and church, and my dad had grown up in a strict Catholic family. My grandmother on his side is a first-generation Italian-American, so her parents had both immigrated when they were teenagers from Italy. And when they got married, they decided they wanted to take us to a Unitarian church and sort of meet in the middle. They're like, hell, we can take them to church, but we're not taking them to either of the ones we grew up in. And so, I grew up around a lot of interesting people. And I think at a young age, I started to become very upset and angered by the world's disparities. I wasn't sheltered from those realities, really. And that discussion was around me with adults at a much younger age than I think a lot of people have around their families. And not super explicit with my parents, but they kind of raised us with a real progressive and open-minded kind of view of the world. And as I got older, I was just getting madder watching it, and that led me into punk rock and skateboarding and doing bad kid stuff. And played in a couple punk rock bands, when I was still living in Vegas. And I actually went back there and lived in an apartment with a whole bunch of other underage dirtbag punk kids for another year after I'd left home. I sort of took off for a year, went back, and then split for good eventually right about when I was 16. And played in some sort of thrashy punk bands. And then a good friend of mine, actually, my friend James Emmanuel, who's a great photographer and old friend of mine, I kind of credit him in a lot of ways for sort of reintroducing me to country music. Oh, big old thunder here. Pardon the clap in the background.
No worries. Where are you at right now, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm in Nashville at my house. So,
cool. I want to talk to you after this about Nashville, because my family's moving there at the end of the month.
Oh, cool. Right on. Absolutely, man. But anyhow, my buddy James, he was a punk rock kid too, but he was a little older. And I had heard country music and country influenced music growing up. My grandparents were, into country music. And, I came to find that there was connections to old time string band music, long dead relatives who had played professionally, in radio bands in the 20s and 30s and stuff like that. But again, it wasn't something I was super immersed in outside of, being a kid in the 90s. There was country on the radio, when you're 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, you just listen to like Mix 94.9, the everything of today. And, so they were playing like, Snoop Dogg 1 minute and then it was Chattahoochee, or Boot Scootin' Boogie. And I remember, whatever, we all learned to line dance at the 4th grade dance, to Boot Scootin' Boogie. And so I'd heard some of that, but I wasn't, like I said, I wasn't really immersed. And my buddy James, he was sort of more of like an avant art guy. And he was the one who really got me into like Blondie and a bunch of the weird sort of new wave music. And then he also was always putting on the Statler Brothers and like old early Johnny Cash recordings. And it started to appeal a lot more to me. And then when I finally left Vegas, I spent the next couple of years kind of just traveling on foot and not really living anywhere, living out in a lot of really rural places. And, just kind of always had a beater guitar that I'd pick up at a thrift store or whatever. Someone to give me one. And I just sort of naturally leaned into country music because, the sort of themes and ideas and stories in it were starting to become a lot more parallel to mine. And not to mention the fact that pretty much everywhere I lived, I didn't have electricity for about 12 years of my life. So the idea of being in a punk rock band was not really an option anymore because like acoustic punk music really sucks. But yeah, I eventually ended up in Vermont. I lived on 16 acres I bought when I was 19, I guess. Really steep north-facing mountainside. Couldn't get up it in the winter. I had to hike in about half a mile in the wintertime up about a 30% grade. And I had a spring for my water that was downhill and candles from the Denny Can store, like old sort of like surplus Hanukkah candle boxes and grill tanks to run my little propane stove. And that's how I lived for about 10, 11 years before I moved down here to Nashville. So again, naturally, it was like my settings that I had put myself in definitely lent themselves more to traditional acoustic music,
Sure.
And again, I was doing a lot of trades work. When I got to Vermont, I sort of disconnected with a lot of the sort of previous pieces of my life and just started becoming a carpenter. I started learning about logging and forest management. I spent a lot of winters, doing timber harvesting or running heavy equipment out in the woods. And, it's been the summertime, doing historic restoration carpentry. I built instruments for a while up there. I did a lot of farm labor and tractor operation in some orchards seasonally and stuff like that. And so they were all trades where I interacted with a lot more country people than I was when I got there, And I think something about it really appealed to me because there was sort of these universally identifiable themes. And so it just became like the main thing I listened to. Of course I put on like Ride the Lightning by Metallica whenever I could get my my rechargeable batteries, up to snuff at a job site. And I could get through about one CD on this little crappy ghetto blaster I had. And I had like 4 rechargeable D-cell batteries and I'd charge them at job sites and then come home and I could listen to one CD at the end of the night. And sometimes I'd just go sit in my truck with a bottle of beer, with the aux ignition on and listen to tapes or CDs in my truck and, front of my cabin. But for the most part, that became really the soundtrack of my life, was country music and old string band music and all the pre-country stuff like Carter Family and Jimmy Rogers and, Earl Johnson and all these like old string band, kind of things that eventually influenced the people who became the Hank Williams and the Ernest Tubbs and the Merle Haggards,
Sure.
So that was kind of how I got into it. It just stuck.
And well, while you were living at the these different places in Vermont and where were you like writing music? Like when did you start writing and putting out music and touring and all that? Man,
I had never really, aside from some, kind of crappy spazzy punk songs that we wrote in, my teenage punk band, I never really fancied myself much of a writer of music. I don't know why. It just never felt like I had a knack for original music. And it's funny because I ended up sort of inadvertently growing up through my, late teens and then, up through the rest of my life with 2 groups of folks that, there's this little town, Brattleboro, Vermont, that I lived outside. I lived in a non-incorporated township called Halifax, about 20 miles west of there. But Brattleboro was a little town I'd go to, and it's got maybe, 30, 40,000 people in it. It's this beautiful little old kind of run down, but real cool little historic river, like mill town, southern Vermont. And it just so happened the first summer I was there, you know, it's still like dirty train rider kid. And, you know, I've been hopping freight trains all over the country. And one day I was sitting on the curb hanging out, you know, with a couple of kids I met, and this dude walks up in a pair of grubby Carhartt overalls, and he looks down, he's like, "Hey, I'm Cooper. Who are you?" And it turned out to be my lifelong friend, Cooper McFain, who's now the banjo player in The Devil Makes Three. And so I got to be friends with him and Lucia and Pete Bernhard, who went on some years later to form Devil Makes Three and become this really successful band. And then also that same summer became really good buddies with a guy named Kyle Thomas, who is better known in the indie rock world as King Tuff, and he's been signed to Sub Pop for years.
Oh yeah, I know King Tuff.
You know,
that's huge.
Yeah, he's excellent. Yeah, so it's really funny. Actually, Small World is the first country show I ever played. Was actually me and King Tuff when we were about 18 years old at a coffee shop in Brattleboro, Vermont.
That's crazy.
No one would ever think King Tuff ever played a country show, I don't think. But it was just a small town, and there was this random confluence of musicians. Also, my friend Meryl Garbus, who eventually went on to start the project Tune Yards, you know, she had gone to Marlboro College, and which was out kind of near where I lived. And so we used to get together and play old time music and get drunk and goof off, you know, and it was this really weird vortex of people who went on to become very successful musicians out of this teeny little off the map town in Vermont. So I was surrounded by those folks, and they were all writing original music, and it was cool. And it wasn't, you know, it was all within loose styles, but it was very much original. And I just never felt like I'd have a knack for it. And eventually, sometime in my early 20s, maybe 24, 25 years old, I had played in a string band for a little while, and we sort of made a valiant go at it. We made a record. We went on tour for 3 months straight all around the US in the middle of winter in my 94 Dodge diesel extended cab pickup with all our shit in the bed, you know, under a truck cap. And I mean, it was, and needless to say, if you go on tour in an extended cab pickup truck for 3 months, your band's going to break up, which, drum roll please, we broke up when we got home. Amiably, we're all still buddies. But it was sort of we all were like, yeah, man, like we're all cool and play the hell out of string band music. And then I sort of, through that experience, realized that I liked playing barn dances. I liked going to fiddlers conventions like I'd done for years, you know, when I started getting into playing banjo and old time music, but trying to force it into the format of lively bar music was not, it just occurred to me that was not what I wanted to do. And I got home from that tour, and I had seen my buddy Caleb Clauter's band play out in Portland when we were out there for a little festival that was going on. And he's a well-known, you know, old-time string band musician, but writes his own original country music and has this real kind of 50s, 60s classic country thing that he does. And I was like, man, I should start a damn country band when I get home. Like, you can't go see a country band anywhere. And, you know, I just kind of fell into it and started writing songs and played them for another good friend of mine that I knew through the old-time music scene named Rose Sinclair. She's an excellent steel player and banjo player and guitar player. And she's actually, I think she's been touring mostly with Wayne Hancock for the last 2 or 3 years. But
wow,
she really gave me a kick in the ass. She had heard some of my songs at this little local fiddlers convention. There's a little camp out at this old rundown sort of, you know, like a 4-H kind of cabin campground thing down in Western Massachusetts. And we go down every year, and everybody camp for 2 or 3 nights, maybe a couple hundred people, and have this real fun fiddlers convention. And someone had mentioned to her, they're like, "Hey, yeah, JP's writing country songs now, man. You should hear it." And she put me on the spot in front of in a little jam session in front of a whole bunch of older musicians that I was, you know, and it held in very high regard, and was also mortified to perform in front of, you know, because these people were like real deal, kind of my idols of the traditional string band music world. And I played a song kind of sheepishly, and then everyone was like, "You got more? Keep playing them, dude." And everyone was sort of jamming along with me, you know. And Rose called me up about 2 or 3 days later, and she gave me the most tongue lashing strong speak about, "Look, man, you have a responsibility to the community at large to continue to write country songs and to start a band and go out and tour with it." I was like, "What are you talking about, Rose?" And she's like, "Nope, no lip. You're going to do it. Like, you need to do it. It's important. It's a part of music history." And that was kind of the final clincher. But I kept writing songs, and one thing led to the next, and I started going on tour, but I never in my mind thought that this was my thing, that I was becoming a professional musician. To me, it had become an excuse to travel again, but, with some sort of purpose, make people dance and have a good that stuff. But it wasn't ever something that I aspired to, I didn't go to music school. I have no formal music training whatsoever. I didn't read books about how to become a professional musician. I just kind of started doing it and never thought it would be sort of the thing that I did, really. And I guess moving to Nashville was sort of the clincher for me. They finally, kind of made me realize, like, hey man, you're moving for the first time in your adult life. You sold your land, and a bunch of your stuff, and I had a bulldozer that I sold, and trucks and all this crap and tools and shotguns. And, I was really liquidating stock and picking up stakes for the first time since I've been a grown up. And that, and even when I was doing that, but, in the back of my mind, I was like, well, I need to be closer to my family in Alabama. My grandparents are getting old, and I was really close with my mom's folks. And, my grandfather on her side died when I was, I think 17 or 18. And, and then my grandmother passed only a couple of years after I moved here to Tennessee, and my mom had moved back to take care of her, a number of years before. And so, it was only about 5.5 hours from here down to Tallapoosa County. And, of course, my dad's, sisters and my grandparents on his side are still in Montgomery. And so I was still telling myself that this was just, there was other reasons. I wasn't just going to Nashville to play music. And the idea to me sounded absurd. This kid who's making country music and going on tour. And I did get some pretty cool accomplishments early on before I'd even put my first record out. Got booked for some really great festivals and, got the attention of some really cool folks, but it still sounded like the most hilariously comical idea of, like, this hillbilly kid who's been living on a mountainside for, the last decades, like, I'm going to Nashville. I'm going to make it big in Music City, USA, and I felt real silly doing it in a lot of ways, but it turned out to be one of the best things I've ever done. I got here and this town, I didn't come here with any real plan. I didn't, it was really just to get a bigger Rolodex of people to play with and to be in a more centralized location. And I barely knew anybody when I moved here. The only people I did know were through the old time string band music world. And it just all kind of like came together for me. I think just being myself and just hanging around and, going to shows and hanging out at the bar and making friends, that's just what I was doing. I wasn't trying to angle towards like, I should try and start calling publishers and try and get a pub deal, or like, every single person I meet who writes songs, I should try and co-write with them. None of that stuff was on my radar. I was like, whatever, just I'm doing my own thing and, hopefully find people to go on tour with me. And,
sure.
Now it's been hell getting on 10 years almost. It'll be 10 years in September that I've been here. I moved down. Yeah, like September 2011 is when I came down here. I came with my old beat to hell E350 tour van with a little box trailer, and that was everything I owned. And stuffed most of it in the basement of the apartment, old house apartment thing I was living in, and just kind of flew by the seat of my pants. So it's
that's crazy.
It's worked out.
That's wild.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time you get to Nashville, at this point, like when you start kind of establishing yourself as, a country singer and country artist, is that when you started putting together the songs which became your first record?
Well, I'd actually started writing those songs a while before. I actually did a demo right before I moved to Nashville. It was like a 6-song EP. And I did it with primarily most of the folks from the sort of like world roots jam band Donna the Buffalo, because I had met them all. They're all big old time music fans. And I had met them from going to the Mount Airy Fiddlers Convention and Rockbridge and all these other things. And so they ended up saying, hey man, you need to do a demo, like come over to our studio in Ithaca. And, some of us can back you up and we can record it here in the studio for cheap. And so they were, I kind of owe them a big high five for giving me my first piece of recorded music. And that was literally just something to sell at shows. You know, I would stuff envelopes and mail them to radio stations every now and again, but I didn't even know how to do that. You know, I just basically had them. So I had something to sell. And eventually, the summer, like in, I think June or July before I moved here, I had just enough songs, you know, maybe 12, 13 songs. And I went down to South Louisiana, to Eunice, Louisiana, where my friend Joel Savoy and his family live. And they're old guard Cajun royalty. You know, they've been there. I mean, the area he lives in is technically called Savoy, Louisiana. And every rice field and swamp you can see for miles belongs to some member of the Savoy clan. And he and I also had gotten to be buddies through that old time string band sort of festival and fiddlers convention world. And pretty much how I met most of the folks I knew who were actually professional musicians. It kind of gave me a lot of help when I started. And so I went down to his place, rounded up some buddies from Louisiana and brought one of the guys who'd been in my touring band with me. And he's got a studio that I later went down and renovated. But when we recorded in it, it was July in South Louisiana. And he had window units and all the old windows. It was his granddad's old cook shack that he had turned into a studio. And so we'd have to run the AC for about 5 minutes and then kill it. And you would get just enough time to get a take before everybody started beading up sweat again, you know.
Oh, sure.
All right, cool the building down again, you know. All right, do another take. And so, yeah, we ended up doing 12 songs on that first record. And amazingly, actually, I came to Nashville and on a random whim, I was out at a bar with a guy I didn't know super well. And he said, hey, I want to introduce you to my buddy Jack. And it turned out to be this guy, Jack Silverman, who's a really great dude. He used to be the managing editor of our local free weekly paper here, the Nashville Scene. And he plays in bands. And Jack's a really, really great guy. And you know, this buddy I was out with, again, that I didn't know super well, was kind of over talking me up. It was making me uncomfortable. He's like, man, you got to hear JP, man. He writes real old school country, man. You got to check it out, man. It's really cool. And I'm sort of like, you know, shuffling my feet, kind of like embarrassed that this dude's sort of talking me up and, you know, just feeling uncomfortable. And Jack was like, well, hey, man, here, you know, and he pulls a card out of his pocket and he's like, there's my address and my email. Mail me one of your CDs. All right. I was like, yeah, oh yeah, sure, man. Nice to meet you, Jack. And about a month later, I did, you know, the next day I mailed him a CD. And about a month later, I got a call from him and he's like, hey, JP, it's Jack. I just wanted to see if you had a time to chat for a little while on the phone. I was like, yeah, I mean, like, what about? And he's like, well, you know, do an interview. I said, well, what do you mean do an interview? And he's like, oh, I'm doing a half-page feature on you and your record, you know, that's coming out in the Nashville Scene. And I was like, wait, what? You know, kind of record scratch moment. And then later on that same year, they do like a best of, you know, yearly edition of all manner of stuff in Nashville. And they gave me a tie with Chuck Mead, who is a friend of mine that I have just a ton of respect for and admiration for. He's been around forever. Incredible songwriter, musician. And so they gave me and Chuck Mead a tie for the critics' pick of the best country album of 2012. And
wow.
that was really sort of dumbfounding to me. You know, I just kind of couldn't believe it. And I think it helped kind of set the wheels in motion for me, you know, down here. So, you know, and that was cool. And then I eventually went on to make my second record here a couple of years after that, with a really, really awesome band, a bunch of guys that I'd toured with in different configurations, you know, or just been buddies with from around town. And, you know, just kind of kept doing it, kept making records, kept touring. So
what would you say, like, from that second record, is The Home Was There, The Hurt Is, what would you say like the milestone from that album would be?
Well, you know, it's funny because, I mean, there's a lot of I don't play a lot of songs from my first couple of records. You know, you sometimes, especially when you're young and just getting started, you kind of grow out of your own material, or mean, in my opinion, you should. You know,
probably get sick of playing it too after 10 years or so.
Yeah, and you know, I still think a lot of the material from my first two records holds up. You know, people still ask for it. It still gets played on the radio. You know, hell, people have sent me links from YouTube of bands all over the country in some small roadhouse covering one of my songs, and I'm like, damn, wow, okay,
that's cool.
But yeah, you know, but a lot of the material I was sort of like, you know, my writing wasn't the greatest, or, you know, I think I was like a kid who was onto something. with a lot of promise, and, you know, sort of grew into being a better songwriter and more comfortable with who I was and how I performed and wrote and all that as the albums went by and the years went by. But I think Home is Where the Hurt is funny. The song that ended up being the standout, you know, I only play maybe one or two tunes from that. There's a song called South Oklahoma. We still playing another one called Maria. But the opening track is this sort of kind of wacky gonzo 60s George Jones-esque song about a dude with a bad case of the Randys called Give a Little Lovin'. And we made this totally harebrained, smart-ass kind of fake 60s country music show video for it with cameos from Johnny Fritz and Nikki Lane and all these other people. And we turned goats loose on the stage, you know, and everybody's kind of dressed up in these dorky matching outfits. And it was the lead single from the record, but I actually kind of wrote it. I mean, it was sort of like I just wrote a stream of consciousness in like 15 minutes in the van one night on an overnight drive, mostly just to be like, oh, that's funny. That'll be a filler song on the album. You know, it's got a good, nice, like kind of surfy swing to it, that real 60s kind of George Jones sound. And it turned out to be, you know, one of the more popular songs from the record. So I don't play it much live really, but I can't discount it because if people still want to hear it, you know, I'm like, well, I guess it weren't a bad song, but so.
That's cool. That's cool. And then from that album, you said you did a bunch more touring, and then the record, the most recent release, aside from the newest song, Sometimes Dogs Bark at Nothing, which I love the title. Your titles of your songs and stuff are so good, especially the why don't we do it on the road, and then
why don't we do it in the road?
Do it in the road. I was like, that's hilarious. So that seems like it was a record that you just co-wrote with those four people on the.
Well, actually, the duet records are all sort of a standalone little passion project. It's all different classic country songs, or, you know, we've sort of expanded that definition as the volumes have evolved.
Okay.
And I just kind of like have always lamented the loss of the classic country duet. You know, it's such a cool thing, like male-female harmony, and you really don't hear it much, you know, on mainstream country radio. And if you do, it's more like, hey, featured line from this lady on a guy's song or vice versa.
Right.
So that was just, like I said, just sort of a passion project, sort of moment in time. You know, I'm friends with all these ladies. They're incredibly talented. I feel really honored to be able to, you know, continue to do these cool little, you know, intermittent passion projects like that. So I've put a couple of those out with some, I mean, unbelievable musicians. I mean, some of the gals on them just, like I said, I just feel very humbled by the talent that surrounds me in this town and my friend group and my community. But the record, the last full length record, you know, it's all original stuff. And you know, all songs I wrote. I haven't released any covers at this point on any of the three records I've done. I just sort of have always written my own material. But it was about 4 years between records. Home is Where the Hurt Is came out in 2014. And shortly after that, we started going to Europe pretty regularly, you know, once or twice a year, and doing a ton of touring over there. Wow. And I was going through a lot of different life stuff, a lot of ups and downs, you know, just a lot of real low points, you know, and a handful of high points, and low points were starting to kind of outweigh the high points. And I just sort of realized that I was getting a little wrapped up in this idea of what my career was supposed to look like, or what my level of success was supposed to be, that there was this equation that led to the next thing, and finding myself like pretty disheartened by a lot of it and really road weary. And I wanted to make another record because you feel this pressure as an artist to produce, you know, I mean, hell, the dink that runs Spotify, you know, made a statement last year about how if artists want to survive in the digital age, they just have to produce more content. It's like, man, to hell with that. No one's telling me how to run my musical creativity. You know, if I want to write one record every decade, I'll do it that way. And if I want to write one a year, I'll do that. But, you know, I've never really wanted to just put out fluff and filler. You know, it's not really my style. And I've never been under a contract with a big record label where I have to produce, you know, every 18 months, you got to turn in a record, you know, every 2 years, whatever. So, yeah, I just kind of waited for the right situation to coalesce for that record. And, you know, we didn't do any pre-production stuff. You know, it was sort of a hand-picked band, but not everybody had necessarily played together. Oh, wow. You know, but it was really cool. My buddy Morgan Jonig, who's the bass player from Old Crow Medicine Show, you know, he actually, I was working on his studio, his first studio out in Hendersonville, doing a bunch of carpentry with him out there. And he was, I was kind of talking about this record and how I was wanting to make it, but I didn't want to rush into anything. And I had a couple false starts with other buddies of mine that I thought were going to produce it, but they just ended up too busy. It couldn't really get on their schedule. And, he finally just kind of turned to me and he's like, well, dude, why don't I produce your record? I was like, well, hell, Morgan, sure. You want to do that? Let's do that. It sounds like a plan, man. Mm-hmm. So it came together really cool. We just got in there with a bunch of ace musicians, and I didn't give anybody the material till about, 2 or 3 days before we went into the studio, because my previous records were very formulaic, and that was a lot of my doing, that I had these sort of models of like, okay, these are the parts. This is when the guitar plays. This is when the pedal steel plays. This is how you trade off solos. Like it was much more formatted in my mind to fit within the broader, sort of definition of like what classic country arrangement was like. And I didn't want to hem it in like that. And I didn't want everybody thinking that was how I wanted it done. So I just sent everyone the acoustic guitar demos like 2 days before the session and was like, don't overthink it. Let's just come up with some neat stuff and let's just work it out in studio. So it was really fun. I had a lot of the loose arrangements sort of outlined and, intros and verses and chorus, the songs were written, but the actual like playing and the feel, a lot of that, we just sort of worked it out song by song. And and it came out great. There's a lot of spontaneous energy on that record. And it's my favorite thing that I've ever done. I'm really proud of it. And I don't get sick of playing those songs, which usually it takes about 6 months before I'm like, half of this is garbage. What was I thinking? Why'd I record that? And this record, there's some parts that, you'll always be your own worst critic. There's little bits of vocal performance here and there on the record that I'll be like, oh man, you should have gone back a week later and just done that, but at the same time, I feel like it sounds the most like me. My voice feels and sounds the most natural to me. Whereas in my earlier records, I feel like I was channeling too hard. Certain things feel, a little affected to me when I listen back on them. And it's cool to have a record now that's, 2 years old that I still can put on the turntable and be like, man, that's a damn good record. Like we really whipped it on this one, So it's cool to have that be my, my most recent accomplishment and feel confident in it and, still enjoy the tunes. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love that you said that, I could have went back and a week later and recorded it, but it's like you could have done that and then another part would have, you could be
exactly.
Like, oh, I wish I would have done this a little bit different on my guitar. It's like you'll just spiral into this never-ending cycle of going back in.
Yeah, and point is I'm not the type of songwriter. I don't have a regimen. I'm not one of those guys who gets up and is like, all right, from 11 to 1 every day, I write and I work on new material. It's like I've never really been in a writing session with other people. It's just like I don't follow any of those parameters. And similarly, when people like spend 6 months making an album, I appreciate everyone's got their own approach, but I'm like, God damn, I would just really I'd be over it by month 2, like I can't. I don't want to go in the studio every other week for 6 months, like I'm not writing, Sergeant Pepper here, people, it's like, it's not my opus. And similarly with my songwriting, it's like, it's bolt to lightning kind of stuff, like I get ideas. Sometimes I'll flesh out like a chorus and it'll sit in my songbook for a couple of years. I won't even think about it. And then it'll pop in my head one day. And then magically I'll, be like, hey, I got the rest of that song now. And I'll sit down and I'll finish it up, but I just don't feel like I can force myself to write. And if I do, it might not come out very well. So I just kind of let it happen when it does. It means I'm not a very productive songwriter. I'd be lucky to crank out half a dozen songs that I thought were solid recordable material every year, but hell, if I got a dozen songs every couple, 2-3 years that I'm proud of and can stand behind, I'd rather have that than just have half my albums be filler garbage.
Sure.
It's just not my style.
Yeah. Well, with that, like so you put that record on 2018. Where were you when, COVID hit and the world shut down? Were you working on a new record? Were you working on anything? How did that affect you?
Well, it was kind of convenient actually in this weird way. I don't want to say that sounds weird. That COVID is not convenient. COVID is a horrible thing. And this is the worst crisis the world has faced in since the Ice Age, since the bubonic plague. But, we had hit it pretty hard. I mean, I've never, up until this year, I'd never taken more than 3 months off tour in the last decade. I mean, it's been over 10 years I've been touring. Straight? It's just always out, you know. I mean, we'd be out for a week here, we'd be out for 4 weeks here. Sometimes we go out for 6-8 weeks at a time, you know. We'd combine U.S. tours with European tours and just be gone for months. And I sort of knew that, you know, what I wanted to do was make this record, go out and support it, but I wanted to be able to have sort of an end in sight. And I was starting to feel like, you know, I don't want to say my gusto was losing steam or anything, but I was sort of seeing the writing on the wall that, okay, cool, I'm going to wind down the end of this big, 16-month tour cycle, and I'm going to want a bunch of time off. And so I'd already purposely booked about 4 months off just to work. And, touring's expensive, man. And I pay my band as good as I can, and I take care of people. And, we stay in halfway decent hotels nowadays. And, it costs money to make records, and it costs money to go out and support them. That's just the bottom line. And, I just kind of wanted to replenish the bank account a little bit, and just have some downtime in general. And I've always been a carpenter on the side, no matter what. It's just always what I've never given that up. And, it's kind of part of my identity. So I had planned a bunch of time off. I had already wanted to make an old time record. I had a lot of fans sort of requesting for me to, record some of the old obscure banjo ballads that I do, and, that I know that I never really perform and no one knows anything about, sort of expose that side of myself here and there, with tours with my friend Chance McCoy, who was a long-term member of Old Crow Medicine Show, an old buddy of mine. So I kind of wanted to do that. I wanted to go back to some fiddlers conventions and reconnect with some old buddies in the community I'd kind of drifted out of, for touring. And so when it hit, it was sort of like, well, hell, I mean, this sucks, but I only had like 35 shows on the books from May 1st through October 1st. So it wasn't really the end of the world for me. They were good tours. We had some great offers and some great festivals, and it's a bummer to cancel anything, especially if you're actually excited about it. And it's not just, infill routing gigs or something, but, so it was kind of a much needed longer break than I realized. And it's given me a long stretch of time sort of away from music, and to think about my relationship with it more, and to think about how I want to approach it for the next decade. And just kind of reaffirm to myself that I love music, and I don't need to tell myself that, there's a picture of success that I need to achieve for it to be something that I still can't live without, and that I can still make good music. I can tour the way I want to, but I don't have to feel like, oh, well, if you haven't gotten onto a bus, you haven't made it yet. Or if you're not paying all the bills just with your, mailbox money, you haven't made it yet. I mean, hell, it's been a decade of putting out records, and I get checks in the mail, I'm kind of like, oh, damn, that's free money. I didn't even have to do anything for that, negating the decade of money losing touring and destitution that I spent. But, so, it's actually kind of turned out to be a really good year for me. I went up to West Virginia for a couple of weeks and made that old time record, at Chance's little studio, which is going to be coming out sometime, I think late spring, early summer this year, on my current label, Free Dirt, which is really fun, kind of a little side project, called JP Harris's Dreadful Wind and Rain. And it's very obscure, weird old banjo ballads and tunes. And that was a really nice break. And it's just been kind of good to have like a day in, day out of, I'm covered up in carpentry work all the time. Pretty much work just within sort of a word of mouth community here. I've never advertised or had a business card with my name on it for that. And so kind of getting back to my life that I had a little, in some regard to before I started touring and trying to be a professional, has been really good for me. Giving me a little, I've written a lot more songs than I would have if I'd been on tour half the year or so. So I'm making the best of a bad situation, I'd say. I'm doing that all right.
I'm glad you talked about getting in the studio and recording some of those ballads. That'll be interesting to hear.
Yeah, it's a whole nother side of me musically that most people don't know about. Like I said, it's old music. It's like the OG country music. This is like, these are songs from like the 17 and 1800s, played
That's awesome.
in a very weird archaic style of banjo that most people won't recognize, so it'll be fun just to get that out in the world too. Just another something for people to listen to. So
Sure. And then tell me about the most recent song, Take Off your tinfoil hat. And when did
yeah,
that, was that recorded in the same session?
Big smiling middle finger. No. So that song, I had gotten the chorus in my head, driving back and forth to a job site over here on the east side of town where I live. One day, I think a couple days before Christmas, I had written that chorus just driving, and I kind of got a chuckle out of it, because I've just, the world is unhinged at this point. People are unhinged, in the state of what we're dealing with in terms of, the label of fake news and purposeful disinformation. I mean, it's just insanity. It's absolutely insanity. And watching conspiracy theories become mainstream and politicized to one side of the fence and used as a weapon and a tool for manipulation has just, it's been a crazy 4 years, and watching it all come to a head has been really intense, and it's really hard for me. I don't like to get on social media a lot. I've been pretty absent from it the whole year of COVID. When it's not related to music, social media is not really part of my life. I've been angry. Everybody's been angry this year. There's a lot of, there's systemic racism, there's police brutality, there's corrupt politicians, there's, hateful homophobes and xenophobes. And it's just been like mounting. It's this like horrible, terrifying dust cloud. And but I always try to make light of things and poke fun at things as a more constructive way to get that frustration out. So I wrote the song, the chorus a couple days before Christmas, and then sure as shit as Shinola, about 6:30 a.m. I got woken up by a car bomb blowing up downtown Nashville.
Oh my God.
And,
I forgot about that. That was on Christmas Day, right?
That was Christmas morning at 6:30 a.m.
My God.
And I woke bolt upright and was like, what in high holy hell was that? And, found out a couple hours later what it was, and of course the information started coming out that this guy was a, heavy 5G lizard people, George Soros, Dominion voting systems conspiracy dude. And, of course, the most insane conspiracy theories started flying around. We're all glued to the news, me and my crew of dudes I work with, trying to figure out what in the hell has gone on. What is going on here? Like, why?
Insane.
How and why did this guy blow up downtown? And it's like, oh, he blew it up to knock out the cell networks of Nashville, which happened for about 4 days. I mean, it was kind of pandemonium here. Businesses had to close because they couldn't run cards. All kinds of, 911 centers were going out. It was a pretty serious deal. And after that, I was like, man, I need to finish this song. Like, these people are they're off the hook. And we were watching the comments, we would go poke our noses into the Fox News world to see what those dinks were saying about it. And, of course, they avoided saying much at all because, nobody knew which side of the political fence this guy was on yet. But the comment sections were people saying like, oh, yeah, all the voting machines from Georgia were warehoused in that building. And that building also controlled the cooling plant that kept the Kraken supercomputer that Sidney Powell talked about online, and it overheated and burned down with all the vote, evidence in it. And people were saying the most insane things I've ever heard. And again, watching conspiracies go mainstream, don't get me wrong, man. This dude loves a good conspiracy, like little green men, evil conspiratorial governments. There is a precedent to believe conspiracies. It's not, people aren't making these things up out of totally thin air, and what's troubling about them is when you watch them become mainstream with they become partisan and then they have no evidence to back them up. There's precedent. Like I said, you've got the MK Ultra program that the CIA ran where they declassified it, a decade ago. And like, yeah, we tested LSD on soldiers without telling them. We experimented with mind control. Ted Kaczynski got turned into Ted Kaczynski because he was unwittingly part of the MK Ultra program. You know, you have things like that. You have the FBI counterintelligence program against the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement. And there's a lot of things historically that have become factual public knowledge and declassified documents that give people pause when they hear these wild theories. But watching it become so widespread, and again, so partisan and so politicized and so wacky and out there. I mean, beyond like, I will believe a UFO story any day before I believe these QAnon buzzards. I mean, they're just, you know, or any of this other whack job right-wing conspiracy crap that's going on. And so I just decided to finish the song, and I wanted to take aim at everybody, you know. Mm-hmm. I mean, I did release a pretty funny piece of art with it that I came up with, that, you know, ironically enough, you know, I finished the song on New Year's Day, and I made a little Instagram video. It was the first thing I put up in 3 or 4 months, you know, totally radio silent on the internet. Uh-huh. And I just filmed myself in my living room playing the song. And it was sort of like a smiling middle finger, you know, and I figure I'm a country artist. I don't get to pick my fans. And there's some fans of mine out there who are probably looking at QAnon chat rooms in the evening, you know, and I was like, yeah, I need to knock some sense into anyone that'll listen. And I did it really just to be a smart ass. You know, it's like, I'm going to surface like a little Jack in the Box with a big grin and my middle finger is up in the air. And then I'm going to pop back in my box and disappear. Well, lo and behold, my buddy Butch Walker saw it. He fell in love with the song and he sent it over to his pop star friend Pink. And Miss Pink decided that it was one of the funnier things she'd ever seen and decided to put it up on her social media. So I woke up on January 2nd and the video had gone viral. And there was like 200, and I don't know, it's like over 250,000 views at this point. It's become like a thing, you know, and I was like, what is going on? And I, you know, for the first couple hours seeing these numbers of views, I was like, this can't be real. This is some internet algorithm stuff. I don't know what that means, but it's not. There's 250,000 people have not watched this video. There's no possible way, you know, but sure enough, they did. And so I, you know, talked to the label and they're like, man, actually my buddy JD McPherson, who's one of my good friends and a musician that I have the utmost regard for and love what he does. We've been on tour opening for him a bunch in the last handful of years. And he's just been a really, really good friend of mine for a while now. And he texted me that morning or that evening and he said, JP, you need to get your ass in the studio, make a studio version of that and get it on the internet. Like you need to do it, get it on the platforms, whatever you need to do, like just do it. So I hollered up my engineer, a bunch of buddies that I've known for years and toured with and done sessions with. And I was like, guys, can we whip this together in a few days? And ironically enough, we picked January 6th and we all showed up for the session about, 6 o'clock at night. And everyone's like, so I guess we have even more reason to write this song since a bunch of nut jobs and white supremacists just stormed our damn Capitol building. So we were in the studio that night and it just felt all the more fitting. And then, of course, the label did a really good job of sort of fast tracking it and getting it up all over the internet. And and it's been pretty well received. A lot of great radio DJs, around the U.S., from different like NPR type and local radio stations that put it in rotation. And
well, JP, man, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, I want to ask you one more question.
Yeah.
If you have any advice for aspiring artists.
Advice for aspiring artists? Yes, I always do, because the same advice was given to me years ago by friends of mine who are already veterans of this world, and it was very useful. And it might sound a little cynical, but one of the most important sort of two faceted statements that was said to me was, remember that the industry you're entering into does not, the rules of fairness and justice do not apply. So don't waste your energy getting mad about it being unfair or unjust or anything like that. And just keep doing what you're doing at all costs, because the best rule of thumb is to being a musician is to never, ever give up. Don't get burned out because you didn't get, the hit single you wanted, or you didn't get the record deal you hoped your album would land, or any of that stuff. It's just, you have to wipe all those things away and remember that the rules of the rest of the world don't apply. There's no algorithm or formula. You have to do it because you have to do it. It's like a necessity to your soul, is playing music. And if you go into it with any other idea than that, then you're kind of destined to burn out or fail. And that's the best I've figured.